The worst deaths at sea in every country. The Titanic is the most famous shipwreck in history. It killed 1,500 people. Here are 4 disasters that are less famous, more recent, and between them killed more than 8,000. Here is what actually happened when 4 ships went down. In the Philippines, the Baltic Sea, off the coast of West Africa, and in New York Harbor, the Doña Paz, the Titanic that nobody talks about. On the evening of December 20th, 1987, a Philippine passenger ferry, called the Doña Paz, departed from the island of Leyte, bound for Manila. It was 4 days before Christmas, and the ship was packed far beyond any reasonable limit. The registered passenger capacity was 518. The actual number of people on board was estimated in later investigations at somewhere above 4,000, the excess passengers having boarded without tickets, in the informal, cash-in-hand way that was routine on Philippine island routes during the holiday season. The ship had a reputation for this. Its owner, Sulpicio Lines, had a history of accidents. The Doña Paz itself had caught fire at sea in 1979 and been declared a total loss before being refurbished and returned to service. That night, the ship had no functioning radio. The life jackets were locked in storage compartments that most passengers didn't know existed. Most of the crew, according to survivor accounts, were watching a movie in the crew quarters. At 10:30 p.m., the Doña Paz struck the MT Vector, a small oil tanker traveling the opposite direction through the Tablas Strait. The Vector was carrying over 1 million liters of gasoline. It was operating without a license. Its most senior navigator was only certified as a second mate. Several of its crew were reportedly drinking and celebrating at the time of the collision. The impact ruptured the tanker's cargo and ignited it. Within seconds, the sea around both ships was on fire. Passengers who survived described waking to an explosion, smoke, and the surface of the water burning. There were no lifeboats deployed. People jumped into flaming sea. The Doña Paz sank within 2 hours. The Vector sank 4 hours later. It took 8 hours for Philippine maritime authorities to learn that anything had happened, and another 8 hours to organize a search and rescue. By the time rescue vessels arrived, there was almost nothing left to find. Of the estimated 4,000-plus people on board the Doña Paz, 24 survived. Of the Vector's 13 crew, 2 survived. The official death toll was eventually estimated at 4,385, nearly 3 times the death toll of the Titanic, in a disaster that received a fraction of the global attention. Sulpicio Lines continued operating. 4 years later, a sister ship of the Doña Paz sank in a typhoon, killing 300 more. The Estonia, the door that shouldn't have opened, at just after midnight on September 28, 1994, passengers sleeping in their cabins aboard the MS Estonia heard a loud metallic bang from the bow of the ship. The Estonia was a roll-on roll-off car ferry, crossing the Baltic Sea from Tallinn to Stockholm in a routine autumn storm. Rough, but nothing unusual for the route. What nobody knew yet was that the bow visor, the hinged front door through which cars drive on and off, had just torn loose from the hull. The locks holding it in place had been rated as inadequate for Baltic conditions in previous inspections, and a 2023 reinvestigation would later note additional construction flaws that had never been corrected. When the visor separated, it pulled the vehicle ramp behind it partially open, and water began flooding onto the car deck in enormous quantities. The ship began listing to starboard. Within minutes, the list was so extreme that passengers couldn't stand upright. The alarm wasn't raised for nearly 20 minutes after the first bang. Emergency procedures weren't properly activated. Lifeboats on the high port side were unreachable. Passengers who made it to the outer decks in the cold and dark were sliding down the hull into water that was 10 degrees Celsius. The Estonia sank in approximately 1 hour. Of the 989 people on board, 137 survived, 852 died, most from drowning or hypothermia in the frigid Baltic water. It remains the deadliest peacetime shipwreck in European waters since the Second World War. 30 years later, the Estonia remains the subject of unresolved controversy. A Swedish documentary in 2020 revealed a large hole in the hull that hadn't been explained by the official investigation. Families of victims have spent decades demanding answers about what intelligence operations may have been using the ferry as cover, and whether governments suppressed information about the sinking. No one has been prosecuted. The wreck lies at 265 feet beneath the Baltic, and several countries have signed an agreement making it a protected grave, meaning diving to it is illegal. The Jula, the ship that sank in 5 minutes, on the evening of September 26, 2002, the MV Juela left the port of Ziguinchor in Senegal's Casamance region, bound for the capital Dakar. The Jula was a government-owned military ferry, routinely lent to civilians for the intercity route. It was officially designed for 580 passengers. On this particular sailing, it was carrying somewhere between 1,900 and 2,000, more than 3 times its capacity. Many of them were students heading back to Dakar for the start of the university year after the summer break. Others were traders, families, merchants traveling with goods. The Jula encountered rough seas and strong winds near Gambian waters, and it was already unstable from the combination of overcrowding and top-heavy loading when it began to roll. It capsized so rapidly that passengers on board later said there was no warning. One moment the ship was moving, and then it was sideways. The Jula sank in approximately 5 minutes. Because it capsized rather than simply sinking, the overturned hull remained floating for some time, and many survivors clung to it through the night. French Navy vessels were among the first to respond, but rescue coordination was delayed and disorganized. By the time comprehensive rescue operations were underway, the death toll had already been determined. 863 people had died. Only 64 survived. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in African history, and the second deadliest peacetime maritime disaster ever recorded, exceeding the death toll of the Titanic by more than 300 people. Senegal declared 3 days of national mourning. The Minister of Armed Forces resigned. A court investigation found the ship's operators guilty of homicide through negligence. No one served prison time. The Staten Island ferry, the pilot who passed out. On the afternoon of October 15, 2003, the Staten Island ferry, Andrew J. Barbary, was carrying approximately 1,500 passengers across New York Harbor on a routine 25-minute trip from Manhattan to Staten Island. The crossing was near its end. Passengers on the main deck were crowding toward the bow, preparing to disembark. The pilot at the helm, Richard Smith, had been secretly taking prescription painkillers for a chronic pain condition he hadn't disclosed to his employer or to the medical examiner who had cleared him for duty. Sometime near the end of the crossing, Smith lost consciousness. The ferry, a 310-foot vessel traveling at full docking speed, drifted off course and struck a concrete maintenance pier at the terminal. The impact ripped open the starboard side of the main deck. A steel pier tore through the space where hundreds of passengers were standing. 10 people died at the scene. A further 11 died in the initial collision. An 11th victim died from injuries 2 months later, and 70 others were injured, including several who lost limbs. Among those killed was a passenger who had survived the September 11th attacks 2 years earlier. Smith fled the scene and was found at his home. He later attempted suicide twice while awaiting trial. He eventually pleaded guilty to 11 counts of seaman's manslaughter. The city's ferry director also pleaded guilty for failing to enforce the rule requiring 2 pilots in the wheelhouse during docking, a rule that, investigators found, had almost never been followed in practice. The accident revealed that cronyism, informal rule-bending, and inadequate medical oversight had been routine in the ferry system for years. New regulations were introduced, requiring 3 people in the wheelhouse, mandatory drug screening, and surveillance cameras on board. The Andrew J. Barbary returned to service 8 months after the crash, with a small plaque inside commemorating the 11 people who died. 4 ships, 4 different countries, 4 bodies of water. In each case, someone in a position of authority knew something that should have stopped the sailing, that the ship was overloaded, that the bow visor locks were inadequate, that the ship was unstable, that the pilot was impaired. The water doesn't ask whether the paperwork was in order, it just comes in.